I try to do everything tonight so as to save his voice. So we will. I think it's my turn, isn't it, Carl? We'll take up the offering. Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together every Sunday night. Lord, as we take up this offering, Lord, may we do it with the thought of helping others when in need, which we know will come at any time. And Lord, please allow me as I give a talk that it be done in accordance with your will, and that it will be beneficial to us as Christians in our daily walk of life. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Before we get started, is anything we need to hear about prayer concerns or anything special that we need to address tonight? Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. And I just can't compliment Clint enough. God was with him. Well, tonight, yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to say, keep praying for Carolyn, because her niece said, when I ran down there a few minutes ago, that this was the worst day she had, with aches and pains everywhere. You know, not anything real sharp, but it just hasn't been a real good day.
Okay.
And I talked to Roberta today, and she said Ian has a knot in his wrist, and he's having some trouble with his heart again,
Mm-hmm.
and just pray for him.
Now, isn't he the one driving for his daddy? Okay.
Yeah. Ian, yeah.
Right.
He's the one that had a stent put in. Ian probably remembers the day.
Right. And of course, we were happy to see Annie Sue here today, but she's still got a rough road, and she said that Lynn is putting on a good face when you go to visit him, but he still is ill. And Wade said he's got to have, he's going to have surgery on his arm broken in 4 places. He's got cast from here to there. Well, Carl, would you pray for all of these sick, and also Bobby Newton, who's in the hospital, South Austin?
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for the opportunity you've allowed us to come to that house tonight, Father, and we just want to take a moment just to pray for these names, Father. Father, for Bobby Newton, Father, we know that he's been dealing with sickness a long time. We pray, Father, you would just be with him, Father, give him comfort, Father, we do pray. And especially for Ben, Father, we know that his family's worried about him, and Father, he's trying to work. Father, we pray that you would just be with him and bless him, Father, and just encourage his heart. Father, may he feel your presence with him, we do pray. And for Miss Carolyn, Father, we know that she's going through some pain. We pray, Father, you would just be with her and comfort her body. Bless Jean as she waits upon her, Father, just give him the grace, we do pray. And Father, for anyone else that we need to be praying, Father, we don't know about, Father, we lift them up to you as well. Father, do what we can't do, and Father, let's give them peace and give them comfort, Father, they go through these times. Bless Robert tonight, Father, as he talks about Israel, and pray, Father, you would just be with him, and Father, just take charge of this service tonight. For these things we ask in your name. Amen.
Thank you. Tonight, I am going to talk about the Jewish people. It may not be what you think. It's more of a history lesson. I am not going to delve into their theology. I'll leave that to our pastor another time. You remember when we were over in the other building that he had a series of talks on various faiths? If he wants to do that sometime, I'll leave the theology to him. Basically, the Jewish people believe in the Old Testament. They believe in the same God we have. They just do not recognize the New Testament. Many of them accept that Jesus was alive and was a good teacher. They do not accept that he was the Messiah. They do not accept the Trinity. They have various points of view on heaven. They seem to think that you have to lead a good life and not be bad in order to get to heaven. But I'm not going to deal with that. I guess it's an appropriate time to bring up the Jewish people because we've seen the war in the Middle East against Israel and the terror. And I think it's important for us to know about these people. Most of you, but not all, are old enough to remember back in the 60s when many of us were in school, and we remember the sad times when the KKK was talked about in the neighborhood, and the Jewish people were not given good press back then either. Now more Christians seem to be open, especially evangelical Christians like us, open that we must love our Jewish neighbors and realize that they were God's chosen people in the Bible. So when we begin tonight, I welcome you to ask questions. Just raise your hand, talk, and if you have discussion or question, feel free to participate. I don't want y'all to be bumps on the log, as my teacher used to say. How many of you know some Jewish individuals? Okay, good. I remember meeting Mrs. Dorothy Robinson of Chase City. Her father started the Chase City department store. A very nice lady. She had a daughter in my sister's class at Bluestone in '73 when the girls wore long hair and miniskirts, and they were no different than anybody else going to Bluestone. But how many Jewish plumbers do you know? How many Jewish farmers do you know? How many Jewish log truck drivers do you know? You will not find any. They are not people who work outdoors or with their hands in that capacity. And there's a reason for that. Let me go ahead and give you some history. I'd like to pace the floor, but I should stand here for the microphone. I do have some scripture. In Genesis 12, 1, 2, we won't be long. Genesis 12, 1, 2. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And in Genesis 22, verse 18, and in thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. God had great love for Abraham and all of his people. He thought Abraham was his faithful servant, and he wanted Abraham to continue serving him and with Abraham's descendants through eternity. But after the death of Christ, the Christians are struggling to get ahead and advance Christianity through the disciples. But at the same time, the Jews were undergoing a rough time because of the Roman armies. And here we go in 70 AD, a Roman governor of that area brought 60,000 troops to fight the Jews in Israel, and they destroyed a temple in Jerusalem. So many Jews left. They just couldn't put up with all the what the army was destroying their city and destroying them. So they started fleeing. Well, where would you go? Anywhere but Israel at that point. The Romans were bound and determined to destroy them. Also, it comes in high taxation. The Roman government wanted high taxes to feed and employ their armies and also send money back to Rome. Well, if it gets to a point and you're really poor and you don't have the means to pay, what are you going to do? So they left. They'd go into Asia. They'd go northeast into Asia. They went all around the Mediterranean Sea. Wherever they could get a boat, wherever they could walk or ride an animal, they would go. And here we go in Acts chapter 8. Verse 1 through 4. And Saul was consenting unto his death. And at the time there was a great persecution against the church which was scattered in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Well, that is talking about the young Christians, but the Jews were scattered about as well. They really felt like they were under persecution and they had to leave the Hebrew land. So in the 7th century, after the founding of Islam, the Arab people, or Muslim, but the Arabs are a distinct body of people that happen to be Muslim. They first tolerated the Jews, and the Arabs had gone to Spain and conquered part of Spain. And that's where you have the Moors, the Moorish architecture, and many of you remember the story of El Cid. So the Arabs were there, and many Jews fled to Spain because the Arabs said, okay, you can be here. And they were settling all around the Mediterranean. Even some possibly went to Rome. They went to Greece. They went to Turkey. Wherever they could go, the islands. And then later in the 1000s AD, you had a group of people from Asia. You can call them Turks, Mongols, or Tartars. These were the hordes of horsemen, cavalry, that we think of Genghis Khan in that group. There's similar groups, and there was more than one. They swept across from the plains of Asia into Europe. They got as far as Hungary, a little bit into Austria. They did not get into Bohemia, and they conquered and plundered, and Poland as well, and all of what we know as Western and Southern Russia, not Northern Russia. They destroyed. They conquered, plundered, and destroyed. So that sets the background. And of course, these Mongols were persecuting Christians as well. So there the Crusades began. And the Europeans from many nations, you think of England and France, and we've read the stories about the Crusades, where they flocked to the Holy Lands to save the Christians. Well, a lot happened, but, and they fought against the Mongols. But the Jews didn't get a good time of that. From the Crusaders were fighting for the Christians, not the Jews. So the Jews were left out. And many called the Jews killers of Christ. Well, the people in Spain, the Jews in Spain, were there for a good while until the Catholic king says, you have to either join the Catholic Church, accept the Catholic Church, or leave Spain. And if you don't want to do either, well, you'll get killed. And so while there was a sanctuary in Spain for a good while, the Jews started fleeing Spain. They went into first France, the German countries which were not united, England, Holland, Italy, and so on. And then in I've got my wrong date here, but in the Middle Ages, the Black Death Plague went across Europe. This swept across Europe. killing about half the population. Even went up into the Norway and Sweden and all that. And Jews were accused of poisoning wells, and many were expelled. So see, the Jews had a history of persecution wherever they went. But let me ask you a question. What is your picture of Jewish people? You remember when we were in school in the 50s or 60s and we had history books? You remember the caricatures and the animations that were in the books of these people? We think of the Frenchman as being some skinny dude with a little pencil mustache wearing a beret. We think of the German as being some stout guy in lederhosen smoking a pipe and a big mustache. The Englishman is some fine gentleman carrying an umbrella. What about the Jewish people? Some of them with long, stringy hair. You remember Charles Dickens wrote about Oliver Twist. Anybody read the book or seen the movies? There have been several. And young Oliver, cast about as a lost boy, fell under Fagin. Fagin was a crook who taught boys how to steal. And Fagin, in the story, was a Jew. He was known as a real thief, a bad example. And in the movies, they depict Fagin with long, stringy hair, dirty clothes, just a nasty old fella. And that's what many people have pictured Jews as. Now, even today, there are hardcore Jews in Israel, in New York, and we see pictures of them. They wear the black flat hats, and they do have that long hair. They are a sect of the Jews who believe strongly, sort of like some of the plain people do. But most Jews look like you and I. But anyway, here the Jews had to move across Europe, and they were some sort of persecution, and some of them felt like things are not good here, we may have to move on. Well, then came a welcome. About this time, there was the Lithuanian-Polish Confederation, and we're still in the late Middle Ages. And I told you about the Mongols and the Tartars. They had swept across Poland. And some of southern Poland is mountainous, but the northern is flat plains, wonderful for wheat and oats. But the Mongols devastated these communities. It was largely agricultural, but they did have cities, and the Mongols just tore everything up. So you were left with the Confederation included modern-day Poland, part of today's Hungary, much of Ukraine, which is now in Russia. It was a vast territory. And the country was so poor and devastated that the leaders of the Confederation invited Jews, why don't you come settle in our land? They recognized the Jews had skills, and they felt like the Jews would help their economy. You had either a bunch of poor serfs tending the farms with no education at all, and really don't know what you had in the city. They didn't have much going for them. And so the Jews came and they settled in Poland. They were tailors. They knew how to make clothes. They knew how to deal with money. They could be silversmiths, tinsmiths, jewelers. Think of any little shop in a town that took skills back then, the craftsmen. That's what the Jewish people were good at. And so they settled. And eventually, the majority of Jews in Europe, or even over half, settled in Poland and Ukraine. How many have heard the story or seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, the musical? Remember the old fellow, the milkman? He was just a poor Jew trying to raise his family. And what did he say? God bless the Tsar, and may he stay far, far away. The Jews were at the bottom of the social pole. But there were millions of them across Poland, Hungary, and which today Western Russia. And after a while, the Russians didn't like them. They didn't know what to do with them. Some of the Poles didn't really want them, but they had settled massively. Of course, Poland's primarily a Catholic state, but they coexisted. But then we'll move up in time. In 1787, Joseph II was the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor was let's call him a king. He was sort of appointed by the Pope of the Catholic Church. And his territory included what we know today is the total of Germany: West Germany, East Germany, Austria, and a little bit more than that. Because, like I say, Germany was not a country until 1871, when all these German-speaking states combined. And the Holy Roman Emperor was recognized as the leader of Central Europe, France being separate and England being separate. That was a powerful thing, all kind of politics and money and all that. And his decree was that all Jews would adopt a last name, a surname, and they would adopt a German name. Why? Well, everybody had a court, even in the old days. Administration, census, taxes. If you have half a dozen fellows with the same Hebrew first name, how are you going to account for them, to tax them, or to register them for the census? Therefore, the Holy Roman Emperor in Austria probably said, you have to pick a German name and a last name. And this custom expanded much beyond Germany. There were many Jews in Germany, but that weren't the only place. Some of the Germans went to Eastern Europe, or they flocked to Eastern Europe. Therefore, how many of you have heard these names? Goldberg, Goldstein, and the like. Today, if you read in the paper, in the business sections, you can readily recognize it sounds German, but there's a high chance they are Jewish with a German name, and that was the reason. Now let's get down to their working conditions. From the Middle Ages up until 1900, agriculture was a big thing in Europe. The people had to be fed, and the people who owned the land could become very wealthy. You had peasants or serfs working on your farms. You had, in some cases in serfdom, England and elsewhere, if you happened to be born on a farm of the Lord, when you grew up, you had to stay there. Your children had to stay there. You couldn't decide to go to another county. You didn't have that right. You had to stay on that farm for life. It's pitiful, but that's the way it was, and the landowners became rich. And they did not permit Jews to own land. The people were afraid of the Jews. They disliked the Jews, so there were laws in most every country in Western Europe. Jews could not own land. So, if you can't own a farm, and you certainly don't want to work on a farm if you'll never get a chance to do any better. If you're stuck right here, they're going to avoid farms altogether. That's why you don't see Jewish farmers today. Now, the only exception, when my great-uncle told me that my great-grandfather, somewhere around World War I, tended a farm, he said, Robert, your granddaddy Stafford County had Chatham Heights is across the river from Fredericksburg. It's all developed now. He said, your granddaddy tended all this land in hay and wheat for Mr. Oliver Goldsmith. Mr. Goldsmith was the Jewish clothing, had the Jewish clothing store in Fredericksburg. That's how he became wealthy, and he bought a farm solely for investment, but he didn't farm. So if you're not going to farm in Europe, what are you going to do? And you're still under persecution from time to time. So you had to take jobs in which you could move quickly and skills that you could take with you. If you're a tailor manufacturing clothes, you can go to any town. If you're a jeweler or a tinsmith, doesn't take much to move. Teachers and doctors weren't always as high in the society as they are today. Think about the old Western TV series when Doc Adams on Gunsmoke. He was not a wealthy man. He was just an average Joe who happened to be a doctor. But that's what led the Jewish people to towns. They are not country people. They are town and city people. And the Jewish people also like to gather together to support one another. So therefore, they ended up in all these trades in little stores and shops. And then you got into banking. For religious reasons, some Protestants didn't believe you should borrow money and pay interest. You could borrow money, but you shouldn't pay interest. The Jewish people didn't abide by that. So if you're a Protestant, you could borrow money from the Jews. I'm not quite sure how it worked, but this is what they let the Jews lend money, and the Jews could charge interest. And if you're a king in a little tiny country and you want to fight a battle or a war against your neighbor, you need money. You've got to pay the soldiers, you've got to feed the soldiers, you've got to feed the horses. So you go to your local Jew who happens to have a little something. He said, "Mr. Jew, can I borrow 1,000 marks? I need to fight a war." "Okay, yeah, I'll lend it to you." That was the start of Jewish banking. And the same thing with the Rothschilds. One of the Rothschilds in Germany decided, hey, I can make money lending to these rulers, but I want to diversify. So he sent one son to Italy, one to France, one to Italy, and another stayed in Germany. That's how the Rothschilds became rich. They diversified. And here's the big thing about the Jews. In those hard times where they're trying to keep a little shop, they wanted to get ahead. They believed firmly in education. They taught their children that you have to be educated to get ahead in this world. And just like anybody else, they like to have a better standard of living all the time. So that's where your teachers, your doctors, and your lawyers came from. Even these countries who would not allow Jews to own a farm or an estate, they would allow them to teach school, to teach university, to be your lawyer, etc. And that's increased over time. And the mission was, you never knew when you were out of favor with the king. Maybe somebody couldn't pay back your loan, and you said, well, I want my interest. Get lost or I'll kill you. So sometimes they had to move. They could not take a farm with them. They could not take a steel factory with them. They had to take what they could, and their family could carry in their little wagon and cart and go. So let's go to the United States. Many Jews from all over Europe started migrating to the United States in different eras. Your early Jews tended to be a little more wealthy in the 1700s. There were doctors and lawyers in the U.S. in the 13 colonies early on. The Jewish masses that came from Poland and Russia in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they were very poor. They were fleeing for their lives. Things were so bad in Poland and Russia, they just had to get out. And those were the people that they came to the ports. Baltimore, Boston, and New York were the favored ports. And they had to take any job they could. So if you're a young Mr. Goldsmith and you come off the boat at Ellis Island, first job you get is in a sweatshop factory. And it's hot and it's hard and it's dirty. But you could guarantee that that young Mr. Goldsmith was not going to let his son continue. No way would they allow their children to do the same thing they did. They taught their children, you've got to advance and get ahead. And this is a theme among the Jewish people till today. Education is their way forward. Now, we know that many of our ancestors in Halifax and Mecklenburg counties could not read and write 150 years ago. Very few could. I mentioned this morning, I think. And it was sad that they, especially after the war between the states, there were no schools. There was no public education. But the Jews have always seen to it that they receive an education. And here's how they worked. If they were in a city or small town, they would get together, and they thought it was part of their life and part that God told them, you must educate your children. And one rich man might hire a tutor. But if they had as much as 10 children, the community would hire a tutor to teach the children. If you got over 10 students, they would hire an assistant tutor. And if they got up to 20, they'd hire another teacher. So they made it a point to educate their children. And that is why we see so many bankers, lawyers, and doctors. One thing I wanted to bring out, everybody knows the old store building set up at Red Bank. It used to be the old store at the crossroads. And wasn't that David App's store? He came from Germany in the 1800s, and he ran that store. He had a son that married a Blanks girl up here at Buffalo Springs. It's called the App Place behind Bowen's store. But I read that way after David App died, that somebody looked in his trunk and found papers where he came from Germany, and he was Jewish. Well, he came to get away from Europe, from Germany. Times were bad. There were a lot of wars, etc. He ended up here at Red Bank, and he knew how to run a store, and I'm sure he probably made a decent living. But how many Jews were there in Red Bank in 1800s? None. So he could have had his Bible, and he could have read the Old Testament, but that's probably as far as he ventured. How about his children and grandchildren? If they wanted to worship God, what did they end up doing? There were no synagogues in South Boston at that time. I'm sure they ended up in Norfolk Church and Virgilina and Aaron's Creek and elsewhere, wherever they wanted to go. They assimilated into the community because there was nowhere else for them to go to worship God. I'm going to, let's see, what is the time, Ron? We still got time. I'm going to give you here some names of businesses that were founded by Jewish people, names of businesses I think that you are familiar with, and it may surprise you. Have y'all heard of Goldman Sachs in New York? Big investment bank. Lehman Brothers, Salomon Brothers, and during the financial crisis of 2008, some of them went down, and you remember Warren Buffett had to pick up Salomon Brothers and revive it. The Rothschilds have banks all over the world. Also, was it around 1968 when Fidelity of Lynchburg, well, I remember in Clarksville, Fidelity of Lynchburg bought the Citizens Bank Trust Company in Clarksville. They also bought People's Bank in Chase City and so on. And it was Fidelity National Bank out of Lynchburg for a good while. And then they merged with Central National Corporation out of Richmond. Central National Corporation was a Jewish bank in Richmond. But they combined, and as far as I'm concerned, it was one of the best banks we have ever had around here. Then look at this retail stores. And these were stores that were founded by Jewish people and are owned or partially still owned by Jewish families. Estee Lauder Cosmetics, Starbucks Coffee, Warner Brothers, and how about MGM? Louis B. Mayer, I know you've seen his picture on the television. He was the one that brought all these fabulous movies out in the 30s and 40s. He was Jewish. Calvin Klein, Tallheimer's department store, Danville in Richmond. Bernard Marcus and Arthur Bank founded Home Depot. How about Levi Strauss jeans? All Jewish people who started these businesses. And you say, well, why did they all these start? Well, the Jews, as I say, they were always under persecution. They all wanted to make a higher standard of living for their family. They were willing to take a risk. They felt like they had to take a risk. Small businesses often don't do very well. We know about service stations and restaurants, convenience stores, they come and go. But the Jews were willing to take a risk. I remember my father ran a service station. He was not a risk taker. He stayed there 43 years, and at the end, when I went to work for People's Oil Company, he stayed there by himself. He was not willing to take a risk to do anything but exist. And of course, he was happy with it, but some people aren't risk takers. But the Jewish people had to be risk takers. Here's something. Think about technology. It's all the talk today. Do everybody here have a computer at home, or your children have a computer at home? Everybody's child have a computer? Well, I think you'll recognize some of these names. Mark Zuckerberg founded Facebook, Jewish man. Larry Page founded Google. Larry Ellison of Oracle. Michael Dell of Dell Computer. Steve Ballmer was the CEO of Microsoft. I mean, these are the largest companies in the world today, and they were either founded or are run by Jewish people. They rise to the top. Then we go into music, musicians and doctors, as well as lawyers. In New York City, the majority of corporate lawyers are Jewish. Why do you say corporate? Corporate law, patent law, tax law, all the complicated laws, it takes a lot of study, a lot of education, a lot of practice. Not everybody wants to fool with it. But the Jews say it's a challenge, we'll do it, because that's our way here. And of course, they can charge more money for that high complex law. Doctors. Now, we think most doctors are wealthy. Some are, some aren't. The only limitation to getting wealthy as a doctor is you're serving patients, not a group of people as a whole. So you're somewhat limited in what you can charge, but nonetheless, there are many doctors who have become quite wealthy. And let's look at the Jewish doctors of fame. Sigmund Freud was a psychologist. Albert Sabin created the Sabin vaccine for polio. Jonas Salk created a polio vaccine. The Jewish people aspire to the highest positions in biochemistry and highly technical medicine that there is. If you look at the top doctors, the specialists, they are Jewish because they have wanted to advance and they have educated themselves to be there. How about, I know this is Southern Gospel country, but are y'all familiar with some classical music? Beethoven and Brahms and so forth. And y'all have heard symphony orchestras. Look at the composers: Felix Mendelssohn, Aaron Copland, Gustav Mahler, Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, all Jews. How about your conductors? Leonard Bernstein, Eugene Ormandy, James Levine, Andre Previn. These are world famous music conductors. It takes a lot of talent to lead a whole orchestra. And sometimes, I've seen on television, some of these conductors can have no music in front of them, only their baton, and they lead that orchestra for a whole hour, directing each group of instruments. They are the pinnacle of musicians. And then the musicians are the violinists: Pinchas Zukerman, Isaac Stern, Isaac Perlman. These are world famous musicians. So what it comes down to, the Jews have always believed strongly in education. And I've read the book where it shows that you compare the U.S. population, what percent are high school graduates, what percent are college graduates. The Jewish people have a much higher percentage of college graduates and doctor's degrees than other people. They far surpass, percentage-wise, any other group. They also have a high degree of literacy. They are much better read than the general population. And here's another thing. I wish I had somebody here I could pick on about your business, but let's take, who here worked at Burlington? Anybody work in Burlington? Don't see any. Okay. But let's say there's one day you come home from Burlington and you tell your wife there's a whole lot of change up and switches at Burlington manager. So-and-so was fired and so-and-so is going to get his job and all that. Normally, they don't talk about it with the children. The Jewish people do. The Jewish people tell their young children what's going on in the business world. And they feel like young children should learn these things. They teach their children to learn a craft or a skill at a young age. Now, I'm not saying they want their child to be a shoemaker, but they tell their children, you need to learn. They feel like teaching their children at an early age, one, keeps them off the street, keeps them off drugs, keeps them out of trouble by studying, working, and applying themselves. They push their children to achieve. And so what it sums up is, when we said these are God's chosen people, they are. Now here's the thing. We are Christians. We believe in Jesus Christ. How do we view Jews? The Bible says they're God's chosen people. We should honor that. We are staunch defenders of Israel. We should support the Jewish people. And how about these colleges up north where they're attacked all the time now? They're persecuted in these colleges. Not killed, but they're really catching a hard time. Think of Jewish people as they're not brothers in Christ, but they are brothers in God. They do honor the same God we have. How about your brother-in-law that believes in God, attends church, but he's never accepted Jesus Christ? He's never asked for salvation through Christ. Haven't all of you had worked with somebody, some guy that said, oh yeah, I believe in God, but that's as far as he goes. That's sort of how we view the Jews. They believe in God and very fervently, but they will not accept Christ. So we should support these people in our prayers and wish them well. We only wish that they would come to know Jesus. We wish they would come to accept Jesus as the Messiah. That's what they don't do. The Jews are very smart people, and they can give you answers all day long as why the Bible doesn't go, why Christians don't follow their way. They can argue with you. But the point is, they do not accept Jesus yet. And as the pastor's talked about in his many sermons, when Jesus comes again, there will be an opportunity for Jews to accept Christ. We don't know how many, but that's what we hope for. So I'm through here. Do you have any questions or thoughts?
Why were the Jews such a threat to Hitler? He killed so many of them.
Well, one, he was a madman. It's also possible, I've read, where he may have had Jewish descendants. He grew up in Austria, not sure which town, but maybe he was certainly in Vienna, and there were a lot of Jews around there. And the Jews were known as scapegoats. One reason, they prospered. There were many rich Jews. Look, like I said, your banker, your lawyer, your university teacher, And many people said, why are they getting ahead? They do so well. And they're greedy. Well, we've always heard the term greedy Jewish banker. It's a stigma. I can't fully answer that without going into further studies, but of course, Hitler wanted to have an Aryan race of pure people, and the Jews just didn't fit that category. Other thoughts or questions?
If when Abraham separated from his family, that's when the Jews started. And he started talking about being children of Israel in the book of Exodus. When did they start calling them the Jews, and how did they get that name?
I'll leave that to the pastor.
I wish I had a little bit of
Okay.
through Exodus it was called the children of Israel.
That's right. They weren't called the Jews until the New Testament as far as Scripture is concerned. Because even through Malachi, they refer to as Israel or the children of Jacob, uses either or. But as far as when they started calling the Jews, it was sometime after Malachi. We know that Jesus referred to them as the Jews. I don't know if Brother Mike can add anything to that.
Well, I hope I have conveyed tonight, like I say, I didn't really get into theology, but it just lets us be aware of what the Jews have been through and why they became the bankers, lawyers, and teachers, because they had to. They had to survive, and that was their avenue through education and being city people. They could survive, and as I say, they wanted to better themselves. And when you look at the doctors and the musicians and other people who have won Nobel Prizes, there's no doubt in my mind that God truly blessed them with talents far above the general population is a given. And we just have to take that for what it's worth.
Robert, you have to look at the Jewish people and realize that's the hand of God that's made them. I mean, yes, God had looked upon them with great love, just like he does all the non-Jews as well. I think of the scripture, Romans 1:16, I believe, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it's the power of God unto salvation for all who believe. Then it says an interesting thing, for the Jew first and also for the Gentile. Hey, that doesn't bother me. I'm just glad we're going to have an opportunity to get in, whether, and there's no other name given among men whereby we can be saved. So the only way they're going to get to go is the same way with us, and that is through the Son, through Jesus Christ. And a lot of people get hung up over that and even offended by that, but that doesn't bother me one bit. I'm just thankful that he grafted us into the main trunk, so to speak.
Any other questions? I've got a few minutes left, so I'm going to shift gears a minute. We know that these Jews, the Jewish people, had to flee the Holy Lands because of circumstances, and they were looking to live free without oppression. There's another group of people that had a similar diaspora that moved, and that was the French Huguenots. The French Huguenots, and the correct pronunciation would be Huguenots, but we call them Huguenots. They were Protestant, God-fearing Christians, basically in France, but also Switzerland, Germany, and the surrounding nations. But this started in the 1500s. France was the largest country in Europe. The king was very powerful, and he was Catholic. All the French kings were always Catholic, nothing else. And there came a point where they hated Protestants. They wanted nothing to do with them, but furthermore, they persecuted them. And there was a declaration declared in which Huguenots would be free to worship, but that didn't last. And one of the French kings in the late Middle Ages, going to 1500s, 1600s, said, away with that decree. You either convert to Catholicism or die. These French Huguenots were Protestants like we are. They believed they were Calvinists because John Calvin taught in Switzerland and France. They fled for their lives. Many went to the Netherlands, many went to England, and then they came to America. Well, guess where they came? Powhatan, Virginia, called Town on the south side of the James River. A whole ship came first, then others came because word of mouth gets around. And the early British government in Jamestown gave them so much, they granted them 10,000 acres to make a town in Town where the French Huguenots settled. And what's important about the Huguenots? They were known in France as the upper middle class. Just like the Jews, they were talented, skilled people. They could be farmers too, and they could own land here in America. They could own land in France. But they were your textile people, your, again, jewelers, furniture makers, just about any craft you could think of. So remember, we didn't have these large corporations that we buy things from now. Everything was in a little village or town. The Huguenots were extremely skilled people, and they were a valuable contribution to Virginia. Now, here's what my daddy said. When the French Huguenots left France to escape, he said the cream of the crop left France, and France has never been the same since. They lost its best people. Well, they settled in Powhatan, but then they started floating on down here just like the Wilkinsons and the Forlines. And you'll recognize these names. The French Huguenots included the Pereires, the Falklands, the Murrays, the Liggins, and I could go on and on. All our neighbors, some of us. Let's see, I'm looking for Bowen. Who's Bowen? Christie? Anybody else descended from the Bowens? Well, but we are descendants of the Huguenots. Listen, Abraham Sally, Sallee, came from France. He was born and raised in France. He left for religious freedom. He landed in Town, and his people came down here to Mecklenburg and Halifax. And Christy and I are descended from the Sallies. Our great, let's see, for me it'd be fourth great grandfather, Elijah Bowen, father of William at Iceberg, John married a Keaton, and James went to Red Bank. Elijah married Magdalene Sally. They were of French Huguenots. And all of our neighbors here are many of French Huguenot ancestry. So I just thought you'd like to know a little something about that. Any other questions?
I went to school with a boy named Victor Seaver. And at the time, I didn't realize, we did have some kind of report, detailed report on it, which we were talking about tonight, about how our people was treated in that. And, you know, from what he was saying and thinking back over it, I think about it sometime now, that evidently him and his family was given a hard time. His daddy made his living being a wholesaler having the trunk of his car, which is the way he raised the money to, you know, take care of his family.
Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. I know it's for many, it's supper time. Brother Mike, would you close us in prayer, please?
Father, it's always a blessing when brothers and sisters can gather together in a kindred spirit and talk about things. We may not always agree on everything or even understand everything or pronounce everything, but the main thing is we know that there's no other name under heaven whereby we can be saved, Lord. We hang on to that, and Lord, that we can bring the good news to our Jewish friends and those who are non-Jews as well. Jesus, you said that you sent us into all the world. And so let us not forget our charge, our goal, your command. And it's in his name we want to thank you for a good day today. I know that Robert's particularly shared twice, maybe a fresh appreciation for our pastor today from Sunday school and then tonight. But Lord, for those who came, and I pray that it'll be something that we can find it helpful in glorifying you. And with a lot of information, and help us to process it in a way that would best please you. In Jesus' name we pray. And all God's people said.
Amen.